Good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Matt Frank, Senior Fellow at the Witherspoon Institute, contributing editor at Public Discourse. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our guest of honor and say a few remarks about him and give a very nice award. But first, representing the organization granting this award, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Balch of the Association for the Study of Free Institutions.
Hello, everybody. The Association for the Study of Free Institutions goes back to about 2006. And it was created to tie together the population of the programs that existed back then, and were spreading, but were all quite small. We're in a new age now, an age of much expanded ambition. And the association still hopes to represent the interests of those programs out there that are teaching American students about our constitutional heritage and the nature and perils facing freedom. It's a little organization, as Daniel Webster once said, but there are those that love her. And the great thing that we do, apart from carrying the torch forward for the study of free institutions, is to give the James Q. Wilson Award. And we do it each time the James Madison Program has its conference. So, having said that, and having invited your interest, we have a website, invited your interest to the Association for the Study of Free Institutions, ASFI as we call it, let me turn things over to Robbie George.
Well, I'll turn things back over to Matt Frank to do the honors. Steve, you can stay right
Steve.
there.
He was wearing a white suit. So
Thanks, Steve. Bear with me a few minutes. Our guest of honor has to endure the weight of my praise, and I have some. This afternoon, it's my great pleasure to present the James Q. Wilson Award for Distinguished Scholarship on the Nature of a Free Society on behalf of both the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions and the Association for the Study of Free Institutions. The association is represented here today by its chairman, Dr. Steve Balch, and its president, Dr. Bradford Wilson. Its executive director, Professor Carson Holloway, could not make the journey to this conference. The association's award, named for the great political scientist James Q. Wilson since 2012, is given as a kind of lifetime achievement award at each of these conferences, which were previously held annually. But the expression lifetime achievement can carry the unfortunate connotation that the recipient of the award is finished achieving or is moving into the twilight of his career, and this by no means can be said of the present recipient. I first heard of Keith Whittington in the late 1990s when a friend who was reviewing the manuscript of one of his first books for its publisher raved to me about it. I say one of his first books because Keith accomplished the unusual feat of producing two full-length books of altogether distinct content, published simultaneously by two leading academic presses from a single doctoral dissertation of 565 pages, not counting its 40-page bibliography. That Yale dissertation, completed 5 years after Keith's graduation from the University of Texas with dual degrees in government and finance, became two very influential books published in 1999. Constitutional Interpretation, Textual Meaning, Original Intent, and Judicial Review, published that year by Kansas, was upon its publication and remains to this day one of the most thorough and persuasive defenses of originalism in constitutional law. Keith's argument is theoretically sophisticated, historically grounded, and legally nuanced. I've been telling any student who asks what is the best case out there for originalism to read this book ever since I read it myself. The other half of Keith's dissertation became Constitutional Construction, Divided Powers and Constitutional Meaning, published in 1999 by Harvard. Here he introduced a conceptual distinction between interpretation and construction that has had legs, one might say, on which to some extent it has run further afield than Keith originally had in mind. Philip Munoz is here somewhere. The key to his original distinction, it seemed to me, lay in his recognition that the Constitution is not merely a legal document, but a political one as well. Some of its signal features, both on the horizontal dimension of the separation of powers and on the vertical dimension of federalism, are relatively open or indeterminate, requiring our political institutions rather than our courts to construct answers to questions or solutions to problems of constitutional meaning. Much of what political scientists now have come to call American political development emerges from the struggles of our institutions with one another as they strive to fix and implement a durable understanding of the Constitution. Together, I think these early works of Keith's presaged much of what he would go on to do. In Political Foundations of Judicial Supremacy, Princeton 2007, he told what may seem a familiar story, the evolution of the Supreme Court's claim to be, quote, supreme in the exposition of the law of the Constitution, from an altitude that permits the reader to see that development fully in the context of the judiciary's interactions with other branches. Thus, it became more a story of complicity and mutual advantage than one of usurpation. In his 2019 book, Repugnant Laws, Kansas, Keith rather astoundingly cataloged every case from the founding to the present in which the Supreme Court has considered the constitutionality of an act of Congress and discussed many of them, in the course of his narrative substantially revising the received history of judicial review. It's a work whose findings and implications, in my opinion, are still in process of being absorbed by students of American judicial power, and its influence will be felt more strongly 5 or 10 years from now. Finally, in his most recent book, The Impeachment Power, published last year by Princeton, Keith has supplanted the late Charles Black as the author of the most useful brief handbook for understanding a constitutional process that has now been used 3 times in the administrations of 2 presidents, so far, in the last 3 decades. While turning out these significant works in the study of American constitutionalism, Keith was also teaching many Princeton students from 1997 to 2024, supervising dozens of senior theses and multiple doctoral dissertations. With Mark Graber and Howard Gilman, he edits a widely adopted 2-volume textbook of cases and materials on American constitutionalism, and on his own, Keith has produced an anthology of American political thought. He has edited other books besides and has published scores of articles in law reviews and political science journals. Up to now, I have not even mentioned the recent turn in Keith's work, namely his scholarship on freedom of speech, and especially academic freedom, represented by his books Speak Freely, Princeton 2018, and You Can't Teach That, Polity 2024. 5 years ago, Keith joined Robbie George and others in founding the Academic Freedom Alliance, and he served as founding chairman of its academic committee. On behalf of the AFA, he has drafted letters to university administrators in support of beleaguered faculty whose academic freedom rights were violated or threatened, and composed public statements and guidance documents directed to the broader world of American higher education. It is Keith's work in this field that has taken him from Princeton back to Yale, where he has just wrapped up his first year as David Boies Professor of Law and Director of Yale Law School's Center for Academic Freedom and Free Speech. It is chiefly about this aspect of Keith's work that he and Robbie will be talking in a few moments. But I want to close by saying what I find to be the core of Keith's frequently groundbreaking work on American constitutionalism. That core is a kind of integrity, a patriotic probity that eschews or rises above partisanship. Now, I know Keith has his own political opinions, but in his scholarship, these seem hardly discernible at all. I believe that if I presented Keith with an axe and a grindstone, he would not have the least idea what to do with them, even if I, an expert, proceeded to show him how. In his work, there is a bracing clarity, a plain-spoken devotion to understanding our political order, evidently actuated by the view that if we understand it, we can use it to govern ourselves better. But I can let him speak for himself. Here is Keith in the conclusion to his first book, Constitutional Interpretation. At that moment of founding, a people created itself and designated its instrument for serving the public good. With deliberation and care, individuals consented to become a citizenry, choosing to live under this Constitution and no other. The grandeur of American constitutionalism is that we might make that choice again. We can only do so, however, if the Constitution is preserved intact. If the choices that we have made can be undone, if the laws can be remade by those selected to administer them, then the possibility of self-government has been removed. The right to determine the form of government under which we live would be reduced to the partisan struggle for office. Thus, Keith. For his dedication to teaching and writing in defense of this supra-partisan understanding of American constitutionalism, dear friends and colleagues, the Association for the Study of Free Institutions presents the 2025 James Q. Wilson Award for Distinguished Scholarship on the Nature of a Free Society to Professor Keith E. Whittington. And now, Keith will have a conversation with Robbie about academic freedom.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Matt. That was a wonderful tribute to Keith, one that is, of course, richly deserved. Keith is indeed the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School. You will perhaps believe me when I say that I am not the president of the Yale Law School fan club, nor am I the president of the David Boies fan club, but I am the president of the Keith Whittington fan club. And for a quarter of a century, I was blessed to have Keith as my friend and colleague here at Princeton, and it was only with great difficulty that I was able to give him up, as if I had any choice in the matter, to go back to Yale Law School to do his missionary work, which he's doing quite brilliantly up there in New Haven. But I've always said that the two best votes I ever cast on the Princeton faculty was the vote to hire Keith and the vote to tenure Keith. I'll tell a story Keith has not, I think, heard before. When I proposed our hiring the young Keith Whittington, one of my colleagues who was sympathetic to the project said to me, "You'll never get him through." I said, "Why not? I mean, look at this outstanding record for a very young scholar." I said, "Well, yeah, but your colleagues will think if we have two conservatives around, they'll have us surrounded." But mirabile dictu, we got him through with no difficulty at all, and it really was a wonderful 25 years to have Keith as a colleague and a collaborator. I want to focus at least the early part of our discussion, Keith, on the free speech issue, to which Keith has turned his attention in recent years. His book, Speak Freely, is, of course, a masterpiece on the subject, as is Don't Teach That. And as Matt mentioned, Keith and I were among the small group of co-conspirators that founded the Academic Freedom Alliance, which is now doing the Lord's work all over the country in the defense of academic freedom, both in public advocacy, in private advocacy to university administrators who have, in many cases, fecklessly caved in to pressure to violate the rights of faculty members, and also in the courts, where our Legal Defense Fund is being put to work to defend people who are the victims of violations of academic freedom. We've been up and going now for about 5 years. Keith is our founding chairman of the academic committee, the governing committee. So let me begin, Keith, by just asking you why you thought we needed something like the Academic Freedom Alliance when we founded it. After all, academic freedom is written into the statutes of virtually every university in the country. The First Amendment applies directly to all the public universities in the country. There's a long-standing organization called the American Association of University Professors, There's another long-standing organization called the American Civil Liberties Union. Why did we need to found the Academic Freedom Alliance?
Well, wish that we didn't have to. I mean, it did seem that there are lots of reasons, right? I mean, among them is that there were ongoing and I thought growing sets of threats to professorial speech rights, both academic freedom strictly construed, but also their free expression rights more generally. And so in a context in which there were increasing numbers of threats, it became, I think, imperative that more people join the fight in defense of those. I somewhat naively, in thinking about the other organizations who are already on the scene, naively thought they would welcome the presence of yet another organization, so the more the merrier, and more allies would be more useful in defending these common values. It turns out that attitude was a little naive, that not all these other organizations necessarily welcome additional people on the scene. And I think so I think in part it would be useful to have additional organizations, even if those organizations were doing the best job possible and robustly defending these. Unfortunately, I think some of those existing institutions were not doing the best job possible. Not only were they overwhelmed and that there were more challenges out there than any existing set of organizations could reasonably take on, but that they also, I think, had not historically and certainly recently been as interested in defending the speech rights, for example, of conservative faculty, as they should have. And so I certainly had no particular interest in, over the course of my career, in the AUP, for example, because they frequently, they as often seem like a threat to my freedom of speech as a defender of my freedom of speech, which is unfortunate. I think it's not intrinsic in the nature of that organization, but it did sort of highlight the limited utility of some of the existing defenders and the need for some additional ones.
Yeah. So both of us are scholars of the law. We're interested in the law, the substance of the law, the words on the page, the interpretation or construction of the law of the Constitution and so forth. But as I've had more than one occasion to remark recently, the older I get, the smarter John Stuart Mill gets. And one of the teachings of Mill in that second chapter, well, it even begins in the first, of which I've, of course, been intensely critical, but one of the teachings that I think is correct in chapters 1 and 2 of On Liberty is the teaching that formal rules protecting freedom of speech are simply not enough. They're important, they're necessary, we can't do without them, but they're not sufficient for freedom of speech and the values protected by freedom of speech, above all the value of truth and of truth-seeking. If they are to flourish in universities or more broadly, there needs to be a culture of free speech. Some of you will undoubtedly remember firsthand a lecture you may have attended by Justice Scalia where he would famously pull out of his pocket a copy of the Soviet Constitution, and he would begin to read to the audience, "The people shall have the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press." The words on the page were beautiful, and Scalia would say, "What a wonderful Constitution the Soviet Union had." But of course, they were mere words on the page. And I think one of the things that I've learned from our experience with universities who have the words on the page is that they really aren't enough. Mill really is right. He is getting smarter. That culture of free speech has got to be created, it's got to be built, it's got to be maintained, and the words on the page are necessary to that larger project, but they're not sufficient. Do you feel the same way?
No, I think that's entirely true. I guess I would go beyond that as well, though. So I think or emphasize a slightly different component of that point. So there are questions about what kind of policies you have in place, what kind of rules you have in place, and are they the right ones? Are they well constructed? Do they capture the right ideals appropriately? And then there's a second question that's terribly important about, do you actually implement and enforce those rules in a consistent and meaningful way? And one of the things that the AFA has been able to take advantage of is lots of universities actually have pretty good policies on the books still, but they don't always live up to them. And so that's the need for the AFA in some ways, is to try to insist that you actually live up to the reasonably good policies you often have in place. And part of my long-term concern is those policies are going to get eroded, and if you were to look at this again 20 years from now, you may find that you no longer have actually good rules and policies in place, and so then you're even in a weaker position in terms of defending them. But the other sort of cultural component of it, I would suggest, is not only is there a culture of you need to actually live up to the rules, but you also need a culture that, one, understands what the purpose of the institution is, which is why the Speak Freely book really starts with this question about what the mission of the university is and what the relationship between the mission of the university is, and thinking about these free speech and academic freedom values. And if you have a very different vision about what you want the university to accomplish, if you want it to be a politicized institution that accomplishes certain political goals, if you want it to advance social justice, for example, it's going to lead you to a very different place, not only in terms of what the policies look like, but what kind of culture you've integrated in general. So partially, I think it's in thinking about sort of what the broader culture and norms are, it's critical to think about what's the nature of this institution we're trying to defend and build, and then what are the implications of that, and what's the goal there. But in addition, I think there's also, it's one thing to think about sort of what are the rules of free speech and academic freedom, but then the other question is sort of what's the larger spirit of free inquiry that ought to underlie those, that we value academic freedom because it is useful for advancing a spirit of free inquiry. And you could have the rules of academic freedom still in place even if the spirit of free inquiry actually decays and dies. And so one reason I didn't pay a lot of attention to academic freedom through most of my career and didn't start doing this till relatively recently. One is I thought that there were aspects of that were relatively secure. And likewise, free speech on campus was relatively secure and so not a priority to spend time on. But also because it didn't seem like the most central worry that I had in my own career. The academic freedom is centrally concerned with how do you prevent the president and the trustees from firing you. And my concern was how do I prevent my colleagues from firing me. And academic freedom isn't designed to do that. And so this is a very lovely award. And when I think about it, in part, it's that when I was a young scholar starting out, I was advised there's all kinds of stuff I should strip from my CV and not reveal, because if I actually want to get a job in academia, there are things that should not be on that CV. And I wonder if this award should probably be in that same category. This is the kind of thing that would stop me from getting jobs, right? And so, you know, and not just because it's a lifetime achievement, whereas I'm trying to position myself as a mid-career scholar. So, you know, and so that's a different problem. So Matt quoted this very nice statement about the originalism book, which I'm very grateful then that somebody actually thought that. A story that I've never told to an audience this size before, but a very senior scholar who in our field, who I shared an early version of the originalism book with as I was about to embark on my first job, I guess. So I already had a job in hand at least. And his words of advice to me were, if you expect to have a career, you should go into the woods with a shovel and your book manuscript, dig a very deep hole. A shallow grave would not be sufficient. A very deep hole, throw your book into that very deep hole, bury it, and deny you ever wrote it.
Amazing.
And then he walked away. And then he became a peer reviewer of many things I was trying to get published over time. You know, so it's people like that I was far more concerned with on a day-to-day basis about can I build a career in this than, you know, might the trustees want to fire me. And academic freedom doesn't, as it's historically defined, as the policies are written, et cetera, doesn't help us on that, right? That's about a spirit of free inquiry and what kinds of arguments and ideas you're willing to tolerate among your colleagues within the discipline. And so when I think about the culture of academia and what needs to be preserved and reformed in lots of ways, I tend to think also about that, right? And part of what's being accomplished now that we've been talking about all day is partially about that.
Yeah. Keith, of course, is a Texan. I was born and brought up in the hills of West Virginia. So perhaps we were both a little naive about the coastal elites and the academic world. But the reason I thought early in my career, naively, that free speech was not something we would have to worry about in academic life is that then as now, academic institutions were dominated by people on the left. And I thought of free speech as a left-wing cause. It was one of the few things that I was a liberal about because I did share the belief in free speech. Well, it turns out that at least today, it's no longer a liberal cause, no longer a left-wing cause. Now, if you beat the drum or sound the trumpet for freedom of speech, the immediate thought of someone who doesn't know anything about you, whether on the right or the left, is this must be a right-winger. He's going on about freedom of speech in the academy. He must be a right-winger. And I think that is a very significant shift. I mean, I think what I perceived in my youth was actually true. I think it was a left-wing cause. And folks on the left, in general, there were exceptions. I myself was one. But in general, folks on the right were not as, what's the word, protective of free speech or centrally concerned with free speech as folks on the left were. And I think the roles have been reversed today.
Oh, I think absolutely. There's no question about that. I think there's been dramatic transformations not only on campus but in the wider culture. I think survey research indicates that as well. I mean, part of what seems kind of remarkable at the moment is that some on the right are revisiting these
Yeah,
issues as
that's
well,
right,
and
yeah.
so we had a very libertarian moment about free speech on the right that lasted quite a while. But maybe that's coming to an end, and so that's one set of challenges is how do you protect these free speech values and continue to convince people on the right that free speech ought to matter. But it is shocking to me the extent to which it's sort of been memory hold that free speech was a progressive cause and left-wing value for most of American history. So much so that, in fact, I've got a book project I'm trying to finish up this year on progressive social movements and free speech activism and concerns in order to try to remind people that there's the story about why it is the left ever cared about free speech and why it was essential to the things they were trying to accomplish. And hopefully in order to persuade them that they should once again care about free speech. But yeah, we'll see if that works.
Let's dig a little deeper into the philosophy of free speech, especially in the academic context, although again, more broadly, but with the focus at least on the academic world. Keith, you and I agree that free speech is not just what Mill called an abstract right, you know, falls down on you from the heavens, or it's a direct implication of fairness, or it's a principle you would choose in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, something like that. Our account of free speech is perfectionist rather than anti-perfectionist, using those terms in the political theoretical sense. We think there are values that are served by free speech, and especially in the university context, the value of truth has priority. Why do we need free speech? Why do we need a robust atmosphere or climate of inquiry and free speech, free thought, free speech, free discussion? It's to get at the truth of things. I think that historically, those on the right who have doubted the importance of free speech or had a lower view than you and I have of free speech, and those on the right today who may be heading back in that direction, think, well, but open inquiry and freedom of thought and freedom of speech can also serve the function of undermining truth, because bad ideas can float out there, bad ideas can be inculcated in students, they can undermine truth. And here, my own reason for maintaining faith in free speech is that I think a premise of that view is mistaken, and that's the premise that understands knowledge as essentially information.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know the right answer to the question, as if you were completing an SAT test. So here we are at ETS. It's a good place to talk about SAT tests, and you need to know that the answer to that question is C rather than A, B, or D. And if you can check the right box, you know the answer. That's what knowledge is. It's that information. And I just think that's an insufficient idea of an understanding of knowledge. It's not that having sound information, correct information, is not part of the picture. It's not important. But there's something that it's missing, and that is that it's important to know that something is the case so that you could check the right box on the SAT. But it's something else, something deeper, something more significant to know not only that something is the case, but why it's the case, or how it's the case, or how it's being the case relates to other things that may be the case. And to get there to what I call the appropriation of truth, not just checking the box, but actually the appropriation of truth, and to get our students to the point where they're actually pursuing knowledge, they're actually appropriating the truth. They've got to be able to wrestle with the best that has been thought and said on all sides of controversial questions, questions on which reasonable people of good will can and actually do uh, uh, disagree. So I think once we get past the idea that knowledge is more than just the right answers, more than just information in your head, we have a fuller understanding, a fuller account of the importance of free speech, especially in academic life. It reminds me of the third kind of Mill's famous what's it called, Trident,
yeah.
Mill's Trident, and that's the one where two people have a disagreement, and it turns out that the truth of the matter is that person A is 100% right and person B is 100% wrong. Why should person A think it's important to honor person B's free speech? And Mill explains that, well, it's because you've got something to learn. It will deepen your knowledge of what you already know to be the case. It'll deepen your knowledge of the subject matter of the issues. If you listen in a truth-seeking spirit with an open mind to the arguments made by somebody, assuming it's an intelligent person, the arguments made by somebody who has mistakenly, by stipulation, arrived at a different view. Anyway, that's how it seems to me.
No, I think that's very helpful and terribly important, right? I mean, I think there's frequently an instance, and historically it's often been true on the right, but now I think you see it very much on the left as well. Is the greater your conviction that you already know what the truth is, the less tolerant you are of people questioning it, of people spreading alternative views, and the more you think it's in everybody's best interest that they would just listen to me and imbibe the thing that I've already got a hold of, and we stop the possibility that somebody might be misled in some way with some false knowledge. And so it's challenging to convince people who are themselves convinced that they know what the right answer is, that nonetheless it's worth engaging with or allowing people to express alternative views or disagreeable views or criticisms of that views, et cetera. So this point about sort of how do you actually educate people and bring them to the truth in a way that has real conviction behind it and that they really understand it and can work with it and extend it and elaborate it in various ways, as well as how do you expose errors and mistakes that we might be making along the way, is extraordinarily helpful. I think it's also true that, especially in academia, I think maybe less true outside of academia, maybe more so now than it used to be. But certainly in academia, there's a serious contingent of people who just don't believe in the existence of truth at all, in any kind of sense, and they just think it's all just about expressions of power. And then why should you ever tolerate somebody who's going to say something you disagree with if we're not even trying to accomplish truth? We're just exerting power relative to one another. And I can sort of sympathize with that sort of vision of how things work if what you're talking about is the polity more broadly or the society more broadly. Certainly, increasingly sympathetic with that's the view of how social media works, for example, and so as a consequence, there's no point in participating in it particularly. But I really can't get my head around people who've decided to spend their life in academia, and yet that's their vision about what discourse is all about, right? It's all just exertions about, it's like, why are you a professor exactly?
Yeah.
Shouldn't there be other things you should be doing with your time if that's your vision of what things look like? And so that's, I think, a serious and difficult challenge, because this whole sort of argument about how do you bring people to the truth more effectively doesn't get much traction with folks who think, I don't care about the truth. I don't know if there even is a truth. I just want people to do what I want them to do. And so what's the most effective way of doing that? And letting you tell them the other side of the story is not going to be helpful
part
for
of that.
me to accomplish what I want to accomplish. Which leads me to, I think, the other thing that for me has always been salient, and partially because of studying constitutional law and American political history in particular, although you could find it in other places as well, it's just this question about how power gets exerted, right? And so the other thing that breeds a willingness to suppress dissent is, partially I think that this is true, that the greater conviction you have that you're right, the more likely you are to want to engage in that. But also, the more convinced you are you have all the power, and you always have all the power, the more willing you are to do that. And so part of why I think free speech beliefs were frequently a left-wing interest across American history was that sense that they were on the margins, they were the dissenters, they were the ones who were trying to struggle to persuade people, and they needed space in order to do that. And if somebody was going to be suppressing speech, the boot would be on their neck. And so they had an interest in preserving space where you could argue and talk. And one reason why conservatives in academia have become very interested in free speech is because the boot is on our neck, right? And so we need the space to be able to express ourselves. And the left in academia has very little interest in it precisely because they're the ones who are wearing the boot. And so if you're confident you're going to be the ones wearing the boot, it can be a little tougher to persuade you, maybe you should make some space for free speech.
It seems to me that there are at least two conditions of truth-seeking that are sort of personal conditions. You might say virtues. One is you have to believe that there is a truth, or at least there might well be a truth, and that it's knowable, that you can know it. So otherwise, what's the point of the exercise? So you need to believe that there is a truth worth pursuing if you're going to be a truth pursuer. But number two is you need to be aware of, not simply notionally, but truly, deeply, existentially, your own fallibility and your own finitude. That we can know the truth, but never perfectly, never infallibly. Never fully. There will always be greater depths that can be plumbed, which is why the conversation, should continue to go on, and we should often go back and go over things that we thought were settled. We may discover that, they were settled correctly, but we may not, too. So the only way you can figure that out is to go ahead and, go back to something that was considered to be settled and litigate it again, all in the hope of deepening our knowledge and understanding. Keith, you mentioned those legacy organizations that I referenced abstractly, and you filled in the names. There are two organizations.
I think, to be fair, you mentioned
Did I mention them? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to mention
just
two,
freeing me to call them out.
I'm going to mention two others, but these I'm going to single out for praise. And these are organizations that the AFA has worked with, and one is FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, formerly Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, on whose board Keith sits. And the second is Heterodox Academy. And one of the areas in which we in the Academic Freedom Alliance have cooperated with those other two excellent organizations is in what are known as the Princeton principles of free inquiry. And among those principles that we suggested be adopted by universities is what has come to be called institutional neutrality. That with respect to non-sectarian institutions, now for religiously affiliated institutions, there's a different set of norms, quite reasonably. Keith and I are both pluralists. We believe that there are different kinds of universities that can legitimately fulfill different missions. And although I think there needs to be broad protection for academic freedom in religiously affiliated universities, those universities cannot be neutral. They start out with a commitment. They're sort of dual mandate institutions. There is a doctrine that is a guiding doctrine, and the truth is sought within the sort of ambit of those faith commitments. And theological knowledge can advance only because you've got some faith commitments that are agreed on, and you want to plumb the depths of them and figure out what their implications are and so forth. But in the statement, the Princeton principles that we joined Heterodox and FIRE on, we urge non-sectarian universities to adopt institutional neutrality. And again, the reason was we believe it is necessary for the university and its academic units to take that stance for the truth-pursuing mission of the university to be prosecuted. You need a situation where the university is an impartial forum where individual faculty members and students, or unofficial groups of faculty members and students, can do the work, create the clash of ideas from which we hope everybody learns, and truth is sorted out, and knowledge is deepened, and so forth. I think we're up to something probably approaching, maybe Michael Polyakov knows better than I do, Michael, approaching 100 institutions that have adopted institutional neutrality. Oh, you only have 40? Well, then it's even worse than I thought, because 100 would be a small fraction. Yeah. Well, of course, they're famously associated with the Calvin report, Kalven report of the University of Chicago. We have not, although we have adopted the University of Chicago free speech principles here at Princeton. Keith and I were involved very centrally in that successful struggle to do it here at Princeton. We have not adopted institutional neutrality, and our current leadership in the university, only a few days ago at commencement, our president, President Eisgruber, announced again that he was opposed to institutional neutrality. And this is something I have trouble getting my head around. I don't understand what service to the mission of the university is performed by Princeton having a foreign policy, or Princeton having an economic policy, or Princeton having an environmental or a social policy. I can only see harm coming from that. I can only see a situation where some people are automatically made insiders and others outsiders because of the views they happen to hold on questions having nothing to do with the administration of the university. Some people being orthodox and other people being heretics. I don't see how it can make any sense for a department to declare its position on Israel-Palestine or on abortion or on marriage or whatever the issue is, meaning that you're signaling to students that unless you are on our side of the issue, you're really a second-class citizen in the history department, or maybe you're not welcome here as a major at all. Or maybe you're not welcome in this university at all. So I don't get it, and I was going to make this statement anyway when I thought it was about 100 universities that had adopted institutional neutrality, but if it's only 40, then a fortiori, why is this so hard to persuade people of? We did persuade our colleagues and our leadership here at Princeton to adopt the Chicago principles, and they are robust. Why can't we make the sale on institutional neutrality?
Well, I mean, I think it's multiple things. I think in part it does reflect the corruption of the university's mission, right? I mean, I think part of the challenge that we're in now is that there are serious and severe disagreements about what the nature of the university is and what it's supposed to be accomplishing and what it's for. And for a bunch of people inside the university, and I think for generationally an increasing number of people, right? I mean, part of my worry about universities is we have a pretty short window to reform things, because I think the rising generation of scholars have a very different vision of what the university is than what I think is appropriate, and likewise it has implications for free speech and academic freedom. So if we don't get this ship turned around, I think we're just going to lose it completely, given that generational shift. But for a whole segment of the faculty, in particular, but also students and others in the university campus community, they think the purpose of the university is to make political statements. That's the whole goal, is to advance political causes, make political statements, and if that's the purpose of the university, why would you ever adopt a position of institutional neutrality? So I think in part this does just reflect a fundamental corruption of the mission, and the institutional neutrality question is symptomatic of a deeper set of problems. And as a consequence, it will be hard to get much more movement on the institutional neutrality issue until that shifts and until you make those changes in that deeper issue. I think the other question, so for me, I think the institutional neutrality problem, right, or the reason why you want to adopt the policy is because if you don't adopt it, it has implications for academic freedom in various kinds of ways. And I've tried to lay that out in various papers. But your anecdote at the very beginning is suggestive, right? So by hiring me into the political science department at Princeton, right, Princeton's political science department immediately became the most conservative department in the country.
That's right.
If the department had a policy of issuing departmental statements on political events of all sorts, it'd be another reason not to hire me, right? Because I could potentially shift the balance of power in the department about what kinds of statements are going to be issued, and that's now professionally relevant as to that, because we do this as a department. We're issuing political statements. We are a political club. That's what we are as a department. And so we can't hire people into our political club who disagree with our politics, right? And so I think it's critical then that that's not how we ought to understand our departments, right, or our universities more generally. So, and so, like I said, fundamental corruption of the mission, and it impinges on academic freedom in all kinds of ways. So there's that reason. I think there's another reason, which is actually where I think we're much more successful. So the 40, I think, is how many people have adopted it. But the practice right now is a lot of university presidents keeping their heads down, right, in ways that they were not doing, right, 5 years ago. And that, I think, is reflective of the second big element of why universities ought to adopt the institutionality posture, even if they have different views about the mission of the university than I do, which is those kinds of institutional statements will feed a political backlash. It is not healthy for universities in a contested and divisive, polarized political environment to be running out there and acting like political activists all the time. You should not be surprised if you put yourself into the political battleground. People will treat you accordingly. And so you should shut up about that stuff if you want to preserve the institutions. And so just as a matter of political prudence, universities should mostly avoid that kind of stuff, except as the Calvin Report emphasized, right, there's a core set of things universities can't shut up about, which is protecting the mission of the university
Yes,
itself,
of
right?
course.
Universities have to speak up for their own policies and missions and values and commitments, right? Which means you have to speak up on behalf of academic freedom, for example, right? But you shouldn't be picking fights on foreign policy or what the right tax policy is, except maybe the endowment tax, right? But
Yeah.
other kinds of things, right? But more generally, right? And so, and part of the reason to do it is the academic freedom reason. But part of the reason to do it is because it's just not going to work out well for us as a prudential political matter. And I think a lot of university presidents, at least in the present moment, have gotten that message. And so even if they're not willing to say, okay, we're announcing this policy where I tie my hands forever, they're at least willing to say, I think I'm going to keep my mouth shut for a while.
Cornell West and I have an op-ed out in the online journal, The Hill, in which we address this current controversy between the government and Harvard, or the government and elite universities. And we take the position that the government is overreaching in various ways. It's not following legally stipulated procedures for grant withdrawals and so forth. And it should obey the law. It should obey the regulations and legislation. But, we say, the universities have brought this on themselves by their own failures and violations of the law with their DEI policies and their assaults on free speech, their violation of their own internal free speech rules and so forth. But then we go on to say that it's at a moment like this when the university really needs the support of the public, where the public is willing to stand up for the universities if they agree that the government is stepping out of line and interfering with the academic freedom of the universities and so forth. But of course, our universities have lost the public trust. And Cornell and I say, that is not the fault of the public. It's not the fault of the people. It's the fault of the universities. They compromised. They lost the trust of the universities by doing bad stuff, like what happened to Amy, like what happened to Carol Hooven at Harvard, Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard, the economist at Harvard, I'm blanking on his name.
Roland Fryer,
yeah, Roland Fryer, and incidents all over the country, including here at Princeton. So I don't know how you get the trust back other than start behaving yourself. And if you're out there acting like a political party or like a church, then you're not going to get the trust of the people back.
Yeah, I think we're in a very difficult situation in this regard, right? Because we have lost something that's critical to us, and it's hard to regain it once you've lost it. And I do think the problem is somewhat complicated. I mean, so because certainly part of the reason why we've lost some of the public confidence and trust in the institutions is this concern that we've been too politicized and we violate our mission and we're hypocritical and all these kind of concerns. Part of it's also a concern we're too expensive, we're not actually educating people in useful ways, and so we're not really serving the function that we should be serving in society more generally, right? So I think there's probably multiple things going on that affects the level of public confidence that universities have right now, and they probably all need to be addressed, really. And it will be I think, unfortunately, a long slog to try to rebuild some trust and faith in these institutions, and we're going to be in a terrible spot if we can't manage to do that. But unfortunately, I'm better at diagnosing that than I am actually at offering good remedies about this. So I likewise have been warning colleagues for years that if we didn't get our house in order, there's going to be a political price to pay for this at some point. The prices come faster than I expected and much more severe than I expected, and just sort of dumber and clumsier than I expected. But this was foreseeable and predictable, and people shrugged it off, and partially people shrugged it off because they imagined there's actually no political price that's ever going to be paid, so it doesn't matter. We don't have to worry about this. But I encounter a remarkable number of people who seem to very sincerely believe that there are in fact no problems in academia. And so they just think it's all just right-wing propaganda. They assert that it's all just right-wing propaganda that makes people believe there are problems when there really are no problems. And I have a hard time quite understanding how they think that. And they are sure shocked that I actually think there are genuine problems. And they really are shocked when I start explaining reasons why I think there are problems and giving examples of why I think there are problems, including these examples of bury my book in a deep hole and strip that stuff off your CV so people don't know you're a conservative. And that's the only way you're ever going to get hired in academia, right? So it's like, so I don't know. I don't know how severe that problem is. I don't know how many people think that is true, but I think there is a genuine and large contingent of faculty at American universities who really don't understand that they've done anything wrong, and that there are any problems that need to be corrected. They really do think this is all just lies. They're being told about it.
Yeah. Let's talk about civic renewal, the renewal of civic education, and the role that programs like the Madison Program and like the institutes and programs founded around the country in civic education and in other areas, program in human flourishing at Harvard, the economics program at Penn, the program in moral philosophy at Chicago, and so forth, what role they can play in reform. We've touched on this, of course, in previous panels. Let me begin, though, with a critique from the right. I don't think many people say this, but some prominent people do say this, that, well, reform efforts like what you and I are associated with and what most of the people in the room here are associated with are really a kind of appeasement, propping up a decaying and corrupt organization, giving credibility to universities, allowing ourselves to be used as kind of the Potemkin village to create an impression that conservatives do have safe harbors in universities. I believe, but of course I'm deeply invested in this and so probably prejudiced, I believe there's absolutely nothing to be said for that view. But correct me if I'm wrong. Is there something to be said for that view that our efforts are really impeding what the real work that needs to be done, which is basically the deconstruction of the universities, that we're propping them up?
So I don't think there's anything to the view that that your work doesn't need to be done or is not useful. I do think there is something to the worry and the view that universities look for some fig leaves that they can use to hide their shame and try to convince conservative politicians and alumni that everything's fine here. I think universities do that all the time, and so one easy response on the part of universities when they hear criticism from outside is say, "Oh, we've got no problems, everything's fine here, and just look, there's Robbie George, we hired somebody." And Yale Law School is doing a similar thing, right? So my worry, in some ways, of going to Yale Law School is they can now say, "Problem solved, we hired somebody," and what more do you want? You got one. And we're in danger of being surrounded. So that's a concern, and I think it is a natural instinct of universities to do that. I think that the challenge then is to make the most of those opportunities. And so part of what I think is important for my going to Yale is, one, is try to make sure that that's not the end of it and we're not done, but also that I take advantage of that opportunity and I try to do something productive and useful. So it makes significant differences at that institution. And it's not just, oh, it's all business as usual, but we got this one little decorative thing we can point to, right? That you make some fundamental changes from the inside. And certainly I think these kinds of centers and institutes being created are significant reforms and innovations, right? And so I think it's ridiculous to think those are just sort of purely decorative and they don't do anything very fundamental. I have my own concerns about how this project's going to play out and whether it's going to fully work, but I don't think this is the kind of concern I would have of thinking, oh well, this is nothing.
Well, I think at a minimum, our programs and institutes and schools and so forth can educate a whole lot of students.
Yeah,
Even
absolutely.
at little Princeton,
Right.
it's a small place. It's Williams pretending to be Harvard. We're a little liberal arts college masquerading as a big university. Even here, we have, help me out, staff, 320, I think, 320 undergraduate fellows. I got it right, Adam?
Mhm.
320 undergraduate fellows of the Madison program. Shiloh's course and mine this past spring accounted for 30% of the enrollments in the politics department, a department with 50 professors. So, we're at a minimum, no matter what else we're doing, we're educating those students to be good citizens. And the same, of course, is true on a larger scale at the big state programs that we've been hearing about and that are doing such great work. So I think that's a significant contribution just for starters.
No, I think there's no question. And part of the panels mentioned earlier, right? Part of what's going to make these new institutes and centers and colleges successful is that they attract students, and that students want to come in those classes, that students want to be majors in those programs. That will make them hard to remove later if the political winds shift and people start thinking, well, we can get rid of these temporary nuisances that were imposed on us in the past. That'll be hard to uproot if lots of students are being trained. But moreover, they're doing important and good work if they're training lots of students, right? So if you create all these things and then no students are ever taking the classes, then it is true. It's like, okay, what exactly is being accomplished here? But if you can offer classes that students actually want, if you help provide students with better education, then you are accomplishing something significant and serious. And that in itself is an important contribution that shouldn't be overlooked about these things. And part of what I worry about, so I worry less about is this are these things going to become sort of decorative items and fig leaves that universities can point to and say, well, we have no problems here because we did this minor little thing. Because it's not going to be minor. It's going to have big consequences and significant consequences. The concern I have in some ways or one of the concerns, I have a real pipeline worry about these centers and institutes, especially how quickly they're emerging. But the other kind of concern I worry about is a version of, not the version that Phil Munoz mentioned earlier of the ethnic studies departments, and aren't you just another version of the studies departments because you two are very political and you're just advancing a political cause. I worry about a ghettoization of conservatives. Like, that'll be the one place, we'll stick them all. And so now we are totally free to not have any of them anywhere else in the university. We will be pristine elsewhere. So we don't need them in our political science departments or our sociology departments or something else because you've got your little center over there.
Yeah.
And that will make the rest of the university worse, right? And so I do worry a little bit that not only will it isolate in ways that are not helpful to the educational process and to the scholarly process of what we do, but it will also potentially contribute to a weakening of the rest of the university if that's the attitude that winds up getting taken. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think it's something we ought to be at least aware of that could happen. And we ought to be self-conscious as we're designing these things to try to minimize that possibility. So that's not how it winds up playing out.
Not unrelatedly, one unforeseen, well, might have been foreseen, I didn't foresee it, negative consequence of the very good things that we're doing is we're removing some professors from state and in some cases private universities to the civic centers, leaving those universities basically denuded of their dissenting voices. I was at a Bradley Foundation board meeting last week where one of the board members talking about the situation in Wisconsin said, we used to have people on the faculty here at University of Wisconsin. There weren't many of them, but they played a very important role in bringing dissenting perspectives to our students. But now they've been Rich Avramenko's Paul's successor at Skettle at Arizona State, and I forget one of the others. They're Ryan, yeah, of course, yeah. So that's a problem. I don't know what to do about it. It's just it's the pipeline problem, and it's pretty clear what the long-term solution is. We produce more in various ways, but it's harder to see what the short-term solution is. you want to weigh in, Keith, on the point that the other point that Phil Munoz discussed about the mission of our institutions themselves, especially when it comes to civic education, when it comes to Western Civ? To what extent, if at all, should we be inculcating values and beliefs in our students, and to what extent should we be presenting the competing sides of arguments, competing sides of on disputed questions, and kind of abstaining from putting any thumbs on the scale? You have a view?
Yeah, so I'm not much of a putting thumbs on the scale kind of guy in how I teach and approach my teaching duties. I view my role as much more similar to what Philip described about how he views his own teaching role as well. In that my goal is to try to help students understand the issues better, to have a deeper appreciation and be more thoughtful about when they reach their own conclusions, they're more thoughtful about those conclusions, they understand the competing perspectives better. I think as part of that process, I'm introducing more of a range of views and presenting them hopefully better than might be true in lots of other classrooms. And so that is part of how I think I contribute to that process, to make people seriously engage with a set of views otherwise they might have been inclined or otherwise just had occasion to sort of avoid or not ever encounter in a serious way. And so if you can sort of just bring the material to them in a serious way, that itself contributes something and is useful. I think some of this is also sort of a question about strategy more than it's about ends necessarily. So so I certainly view what I try to do as a teacher as advancing and contributing to creating a free society, advancing Western civilization, preserving a lot of key values. And the question is, how do you do that most effectively? And so my inclination is, as you sort of described, to try to bring students to engage with the arguments rather than my proselytizing a set of arguments, in part because I just don't think I'm very good at that necessarily. And I find it, as a student, I found it much less interesting and less useful. And so, you're going to lose some, potentially, as a consequence. I have not persuaded as many students to be originalists as I might prefer, right? But I think that if I get them at least to leave my classroom with a much better understanding of originalism, they no longer have the straw man version of originalism in their head. They've got a serious version. They understand what the arguments are. They're willing to grapple with them in serious ways, even if they come to disagree with what I view about that, for example, among other issues. I'm okay with that. And I think I've contributed something important to the larger process, and something important then to maintaining the values we care about in the long run.
There's a story, it's very common in my experience over 4 decades at Princeton, but let me illustrate it with the case of one particular student, someone that some of you might know of, or at least have heard of. J.D. Vance's chief of staff is a young man named Jacob Reeses. Do some of you know Jacob? Jacob was our student here a number of years ago. He came to us from central New Jersey, suburban community in central New Jersey, public high school. And in the summer of his senior year, he worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign. And then he came to Princeton, and he took my civil liberties course and found it very interesting. It was the first time in his life he had ever heard a conservative argument. Now, that's not because I was preaching a conservative argument. I teach the way Keith does and the way Philip does. I present the best arguments on both sides. I like to think that if you didn't know my views, now all my students do know my views, but if they didn't, if you're just a Martian, I try to make it the case that you wouldn't be able to figure out what I think, because I'm going to attack whatever the student says in defense of whatever his or her position is. But this was the first time Jacob had encountered conservative arguments, and guess what? He found them persuasive, and he found himself beginning to move politically. Today, he's J.D. Vance's chief of staff. Right? And as I say, that's a very familiar story. And I promise you that was not my conscious goal. But I think it is that kind of movement. It could go in the other direction, although in my experience that's been rare. But my goal is to try to get them to think as deeply as possible. critically, including self-critically as possible, and for themselves. And in a great many cases, people don't end up, when they do that, people don't end up where they began. And the reality is that, at least at Princeton, I don't know what it's like at your places, at least at Princeton, most kids come in not having the slightest idea why conservatives think what they think, whether it's on marriage, whether it's on abortion, whether it's on foreign policy, whether it's on taxation, whether it's on the market economy. You know, they've basically been pre-indoctrinated by their schools and their ambient culture. And so they get to Princeton, and for the first time, it's like the kid from rural Indiana who's an Eagle Scout and a member of the evangelical church, and he comes to the Ivy League college and for the first time hears about Darwin and the critical approach to the Bible. Except the roles are reversed here, and I'm in the position of the teacher who's telling them about Darwin and the form criticism of the Bible. So it seems to me, if your goal really was to get students to think the way you think, if you're on the conservative side at least, probably the best way to do that is to actually present them with the best arguments on the competing sides.
Well, I think that's right in general. I mean, it's also true that you're most effective with students. Like I said, teaching styles vary. Other people have different experiences with it, and other people have different skill sets in terms of their teaching. So I had the great privilege of being a preceptor, teaching assistant for you when I was starting out here as junior faculty. That's probably one of the last Princeton faculty in the politics department to actually serve as the teaching assistant for another professor. This used to be the common way things worked at Princeton. So I've seen you teach in a classroom environment, and I can certainly testify to exactly what that experience looked like. Not too long after I did that, there was some real effort around Princeton and sort of conversations around Princeton about you shouldn't be allowed to teach the Con-Terp class because students who took con law would have to take you, and it'd be terrible. They were exposed to you because of how you were indoctrinating all the students, and because those are people who sort of knew nothing except sort of your public reputation as an advocate, right? And I had not seen your classroom behavior and experience in part, right? I think students who walk in, right, have their eyes opened up about sort of what it means to encounter conservative arguments, what it means to encounter a conservative scholar, what it means to engage with these ideas in a serious way. And that helps in all kinds of ways in sort of advancing people's education and leading them to a different place than they might have started from. But it's also true that I at least tend to find I've got to meet the students where they are. And for an awful lot of students, they're coming in with a lot of skepticism and concern about values and ideas that I care about a lot. These days, for example, like free speech. And so I've got to begin with the fact that they're already pretty skeptical. And if I just go in hammer and tongs at them on this, I'm just going to scare them away. I'm not going to be able to bring them to a better position by ignoring what their concerns are, ignoring their arguments or whatever, or just, I think, at least for me, strongly advocating on this view. What I got to do, at least, is try to figure out where they are, what their concerns are, and do the best I can to array the sets of arguments and ideas around those, and try to get them to think them through more carefully. And if I can do that, as you say, I have some optimism that I can get them moving in the right direction. I'm not going to get them all. I'm going to lose some.
Yeah.
But it is the optimism that underlies me as a scholar and teacher, that I am still convinced that if I give you good arguments, I might actually persuade you and get you there. But the question is, I think, in part again about strategy and teaching style, about how do you present the good arguments? What does that look like? Does that mean you got to be really proselytizing it, or is it something else?
I have had the experience, I'm assuming you've had it, Keith, probably everyone has it, who does try to teach the competing arguments and not put a thumb on the scale, of some students getting frustrated and just saying, yeah, but what's the answer? Have you ever had that happen? I mean,
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah, it does happen. Look, the floor is open. Let's bring in our audience. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Jim Stoner. John's got the microphone there. And David.
Louisiana State University, Jim Stoner. A question that's theoretical and practical, and I think they're connected. Theoretical question, maybe you answered. It had to do with institutional neutrality, which I think you clarified, or between the two of you clarified, isn't actually neutral all the way down. There are some fundamental commitments of the university, presumably to the search for truth and therefore to rationality. And I wonder how far that goes in other dimensions, for example, in the governance of student behavior or things of that sort, because there's a certain kind of person to commit as to develop rationality requires a certain kind of personal development and commitment. Elon Musk might put that to refutation, but it's sort of open question at least. But then the practical question is, well, if that's so, does AFA have like a legislative committee? What is it that could be done from outside that would positively call universities back to that position? I realize that often when legislatures act, or administrators, I mean, they go too far, they're clumsy, they're excessive, et cetera. For instance, I know you had a statement against the Florida legislation that was then suspended by the courts and they didn't appeal it. But
Well, just to clarify that.
Yeah.
I mean, it was about not the whole of the Stop Woke
Right.
Act, but about the particular provision of the Stop Woke Act that forbade the teaching of divisive concepts.
devices at the university level.
University
Right,
level,
right.
yeah.
So maybe there, but what could have been done with that? Because it did strike me at the time that, of course, or at least it seemed to me, what the legislature was trying to do, or the governor and the legislature were trying to do in Florida, was actually protect academic freedom or restore that culture of free inquiry. It might be that no legislation can create a culture, but is there something that would be proper that a legislature could do to bring back their own universities that have really gone astray in the way that you've admitted that they have?
So I actually do tend to think that these civic centers are probably the best kind of intervention for legislatures to make. I do think there are inevitably, and just to elaborate that, I guess, a little bit, is in part because if you think you have some failing institutions, right, one thing you do is you intervene directly in them, you shut them down and that kind of thing, and I think that's too heavy-handed, too much of an imposition on academic freedom, and sets problematic precedents down the road. The alternative is you create some new institutions beside them, and maybe in the long run you shut down sort of failing institutions, and over time, gradually, but you don't necessarily need to do it right away, right? So, for example, there are these universities that have, there's some that have both political science departments and international relations departments, and that's partially because at one point one of the departments was failing, and so they created a new one. And sometimes they have only international relations department because their political science department was failing, and they just eventually eliminated the political science department after having created a new successful department on the side. And there are other models as well as to how you sort of deal with sort of failing institutions of that sort. So, right, there's one kind of thing like that. I think it's inevitable that legislatures are going to have an interest in funding and what priorities are in universities, right? The federal government does as well. I mean, I actually think part of the problem that universities have right now is the federal government has a very heavy interest in what it was prioritizing in government and spending in universities, and spending a tremendous amount of money to encourage universities to engage in behavior I thought was pretty bad, and go down the wrong path in various ways. So I think it's not inappropriate for a university to be thinking, are certain departments, majors, centers, things we need to be funding and spending our resources, our limited resources on, or should we instead be prioritizing other kinds of things? Likewise, I mean, I think much more questionable, but it's an interesting sort of question on the margins, are things like you see legislatures increasingly intervening on things like gen ed requirements for undergraduate majors, and part of the and I think there's a version of that intervention that would be quite troubling and problematic. There's a version of it that's more viewpoint neutral. So less like what the Stop Woke Act tried to do, and saying there are things you're not allowed to talk about in these classes, but instead to emphasize, look, there are some subjects we really think it's important for the students to encounter, and we want you to encounter them in your classes, and engage with them here. And again, it goes back to this question of public confidence and trust. I just wrote a paper on sort of what the political conditions are of university autonomy. And part of them is, I think, that we have to maintain a public confidence that we're doing a good job, right? The rationale for why you leave us alone to run our universities is we are the experts, we know what we're doing, you will screw it up if you try to intervene and tell us how to teach quantum physics or whatever, and we're going to do a good job with it. And then if the politicians and normies look at it and say, yeah, but now your English department doesn't teach any Shakespeare and it just teaches TikTok videos and comic books, it's going to be hard to persuade them that trust us, we're the experts, right?
Exactly.
And so we got to sustain that public confidence that we're actually doing a good job with this. And these are good questions, and especially on some of these issues about sort of gen ed requirements in particular, for example. Unsurprisingly, a lot of amateurs think they're going to have opinions, right? So if you tell them, tell us what quantum physics book I should adopt, they're going to say, I got no idea. Tell us, whether or not ethnic studies or sociology ought to be, or women's studies ought to be in your gen ed requirement. A lot of people think they have a good idea about that, right? And it's going to take a lot more persuading to convince them, your idea is probably wrong-headed about this. You really ought to trust us on this dimension, right? So like I said, I think some of that starts inching into areas that are going to be pretty problematic and troublesome about the quality of the education that university can provide, and that can go too far in problematic ways. I think there's probably some space there, right? And some of it's unavoidable space. Certainly the funding, the core funding questions about, what kinds of resources does your institution have and how is it spending it? That's just unavoidably a political question. And it has implications for what universities do, but it's unavoidable. I was just on a panel yesterday where somebody tried to gin up an argument that there's an academic freedom right to have as much funding as you want to do your stuff. It's like, I don't think that's going to work.
Jim, you're right that institutional neutrality does not mean neutrality about everything. It doesn't mean neutrality on the question of whether we should be pursuing the truth or whether there is a truth to be pursued. It doesn't mean neutrality on integrity or on honesty or on whether the boys should be in the girls' bathrooms or even the boys should be in the girls' bedrooms. It's not neutrality about that kind of stuff. It's neutrality about the kinds of issues that reasonable people of goodwill disagree on, and the university doesn't need to take a stand in order to run itself. I mean, there's some things you have to take a stand on. I mean, including, are you going to have separate men's and women's dorms? Either will or you won't, right? You're going to have a stand about that. But that is sometimes mistake. When people hear the term neutrality, they sometimes think, well, it must be neutrality all the way down. And of course, that's impossible. But that's not what the Calvin Report is all about. So
and I should also just note, I have an article out now on the Indiana intellectual diversity statute. So this is an Indiana statute passed last legislative session that some other states are now starting to look at as well, which requires their public universities, it imposes a mandate on their public universities that individual professors in their classes have to teach a diverse range of materials and ideas in their classes. They've got some bells and whistles trying to limit the scope of that in various ways, which is primarily enforced by the Board of Trustees denying people tenure if they're accused of not being sufficiently intellectually diverse in how they do their own teaching in particular. And in the article, I try to walk through what are the practical concerns about how this is going to work, right? And so I think as a kind of legislative intervention, I think there are some aspects of what it can be understood to do. They're actually reasonable and appropriate. But there are other implications, especially as the law is written, that are going to be much more problematic. And so some of it's pretty nuanced. I think if you're careful about how you did it, I think there's some room for maneuvering here. But it's hard for legislatures to be careful, which is one reason why you don't really want to invite legislatures in the room, which is why you want to do a good job of maintaining your own institution so legislators don't feel like they have to wade in. So.
Yeah, exactly. David Forte in the front here.
Hi, David Forte, now on the faculty of the James Wilson Institute. Keith, thank you for everything you've done, and thank you for what you're about to do at Yale. I have a question about the classroom and teaching. And I draw this from the power of your writings on the Constitution. When I'm in the classroom and I attempt to explain the depth of the Constitution, I have to, and here I take a position, and I wonder whether I'm correct or not, that we are a people that exist over time, that we cannot understand the Constitution and its power over us, nor even the normative nature of the rule of law, until we see ourselves as a people over time. Now that's a position. but I think it's a grounding position. I cannot teach constitutional law properly without. Can you tell me how you handle that?
So I think that's fundamentally right. We have to see ourselves, and it requires a constant political construction of seeing ourselves as a people, a coherent people that exist over time. One kind of implication of that sort of living constitutionalists would draw is we are people over time, and so the current people can sort of do what they want. The Constitution draws all its authority from the present generation, so they sort of lose the over time aspect of it a lot of times in order to emphasize, well, we're the people, we the people. And so we ought to be able to do what we want. But I think even for an originalist, for example, it's critical to recognize the Constitution will lose its authority if it's understood as a foreign imposition on us today, right? And the way in which we avoid it being a foreign imposition is, one, the content's actually got to be reasonable in the sense that we can still sort of imagine ourselves living with an institution like this, right? If it has a bunch of unreasonable things from our perspective are totally unreasonable, it's going to lose authority anyway. But part of what it means, I think, to sustain the authority of the Constitution over time is that sense that this is part of our project, that we're part of and we have joined in. And part of, I think, a relatively recent challenge, I mean, it's a different challenge, I think, than the progressives were raising. I think it's sort of a 1960s and beyond kind of challenge of this real sense of, no, we're in year zero. None of those people matter. I have nothing to do with those people. They don't look like me. And so as a consequence, they're not my people and I'm not part of their people. And so any document or law or structure or institution or practice that they came up with and developed is an alien imposition by an imperial overlord on me. And if that's your attitude about your own government and your own constitutional system or your own university, we're in a world of hurt, right? And so I think one of the crucial obligations for us as a society is to try to socialize people into not thinking that way and not be balkanized in that kind of way. And that some of that balkanization is racial and otherwise, but some of that balkanization is temporal. And so the kinds of effort that people went through earlier in our history to sort of do the George Washington can't tell a lie and chop down cherry tree kind of thing was precisely to try to build that connection, right, between us and them. And see our joint institutions as a common project that we are ourselves a part of and that we are guardians of and we are trustees of a legacy that we've inherited and we're trying to pass on into the future. And part of the civic education project in general, right, broadly construed, including from these kind of centers, I think is engaging in that kind of project, and part of what I try to do when I teach American political thought and teach constitutional law is trying to walk people through that notion of this is not like some foreign world that was happening. These are people just like you who are grappling with the same problems and concerns you are. They have the same values and ideas generally as you do as well. And you can see yourself in them, even if they look different than you, even if they talk funny, et cetera. And you should see yourself in them. And you should take on board their ideas and commitments and their arguments as things you can engage with as live exchanges and arguments. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them all the time and all that kind of stuff. But you are part of the same project as what they're engaged in, and you are part of the same people as what they are engaged in. But you know, that's a challenging project to make people see that and engage with it. And like I said, I think if we can't do that successfully as a society, it is very bad for a project of self-government and constitutional government in general.
Gosh, I wish I had a recording or a transcript of that beautiful answer. So true. If Chris and Paul can both be succinct, we'll get two final questions in. Chris Wolf and Paul Curry.
Uh-oh, you're on the clock then.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
This may be a kind of for the record question, but it has to do with exactly, put to the side for the moment the rhetorical necessities of making a strong case for free speech, okay? And just think about it kind of intellectually in itself. Would you want to say that the case for free speech could be made in a book that parallels Irving Kristol's book, Two Cheers for Capitalism? That is, does the real case for free speech is it a two cheers for free speech? I think especially because it involves, I worry about this because on the right today, there's a lot of free speech absolutism that's just very kind of cheerfully accepting a lot of the costs of free speech without giving it sufficient weight. And I think that's true in Mill himself as well. I mean, I'm at the end of the day, I'm on your side, and I'm on a Mill side to a great extent, although he downplays actually some of the most serious harms of free speech. Above all, whether or not it is harmful to believe that something that is false is true, something that Mill actually never acknowledges as a harm to free speech. So I guess I just want to hear you saying, 2 cheers for free speech.
Over to Paul.
Yeah, I like that, and I should steal it and use it actually as a title for something, because I think that's right. I think free speech advocates make a mistake if they try to downplay too much the harms of free speech and pretend like there are no genuine harms. I think instead we ought to acknowledge the fact, yes, there are dangers and there are genuine harms that emerge out of free speech, and yet it's important to protect it anyway because it'll be worse if we don't have it, and there are countervailing gains to be had. But we shouldn't try to sweep under the rug the fact that there are costs.
In my book that's coming out in July, I make the point that it overclaims to say that in the free marketplace of ideas, the truth will always win out.
Yeah.
We have no guarantee of that in this vale of tears. But I would stand by the argument that in the free marketplace of ideas, we've got the best shot at getting at the truth and correcting errors, knowing that all of us are fallible. All of us right now believe things that are actually false. And if we're going to swap out the false ideas in our head, as many as possible, and replace them with true ideas, we're going to need to be open to being challenged and not shut down the people who challenge it. Paul.
Thank you for this. Congratulations, Keith. The reaction has become national now that this renewal of civic education effort, public universities now to private universities, is a political project, and it's affirmative action for political conservatives. It's DEI for political conservatives. So would the two of you respond as to why you heartily agree with that view, or you think, no, you're missing the point of why trustees, deans, provosts in a private university, or the analogs in a public university might say, for the sake of the university, we think these ideas ought to be reintroduced, reinserted in some way or other, and then it depends on the campus.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, I think in part, one should recognize the mixed motives of those who are advocating or adopting these kinds of reforms. So undoubtedly there are some people who are advancing these in legislatures and like precisely because they do want a kind of DEI for conservatives. And, okay, so fine. Then the question is, what else could that explain, can justify these kinds of actions? And I think there are other arguments to help justify them. I think it's also true that if they are implemented badly, they can look a lot like the kinds of things people complain about sort of a DEI kind of program or affirmative action kind of program, right? So one thing that's essential to the success of these projects, I think, is that we not lower standards in order to make them work, right? And so that will be essential not only to living up to our own principles, the kind of arguments we have conservatives often make about affirmative action and the like, is all about sort of the importance of maintaining standards in the academic enterprise, and we have to uphold that here too, right? So we want to be consistent about it. But it's also true, I think that's going to be crucial to the success of these projects. So if people look at these things 10 years later and say, and make it stick, the kind of claim that this was just DEI for conservatives, and part of the rationale is not because we can look at it and it's a bunch of conservatives, which will not always be true, frankly, the way a lot of these things are being organized, right? A lot of people will just say, I just wanted to study some military history, please, and maybe I'd like to do some Shakespeare here, and those things won't be tolerated in other departments, and so, I vote for Marx if I could, but, I just like to teach some Shakespeare. So there'll be some of that too, right? So it probably won't be all just conservatives over there. But in addition, I think the most significant defense of that kind of claim is to say, but these people are good, right? And so I don't care what their politics look like. At the end of the day, they're solid scholars doing solid work, and they belong in the university to do that work. And it's a shame y'all weren't doing it a different way, and so that we had to do it this way, right? That's, I think, the defense. That's the best defense of those who get accused of being the beneficiaries of affirmative action and DEI stuff as well, right? If they could point to the things that conservative critics are saying, oh, those are just DEI hires. If you can point to them and say, no, no, those are actually excellent scholars doing excellent work, then the argument ought to fade away in those contexts, right? And so I think it's critical that we not expose ourselves to being in that kind of situation.
In the last 2 decades of his life, I got to know Jim Wilson, James Q. Wilson, very well. We served for 6 years together on the President's Council on Bioethics, and he was a great cheerleader for the James Madison Program and a great encourager of the work that we were doing here. So I can tell you for sure, I know how honored Jim would feel to have this award in his name conferred on a scholar of the stature and accomplishment. And not only that, a person whose values align so well with Jim's academic values as Keith. Congratulations. Keith.
No, thank you.
I think that's a standing ovation.